Validity and reliability. In the English language, validity and reliability are generally used interchangeably. So when you mean validity, you also mean reliability. When you say reliability, you also mean validity. In science, though, they are different concepts. They're not opposite concepts, but they're just different concepts. Validity measures correlation, while reliability measures consistency. Validity asks the question of, is it accurate? Is it correct? Whereas reliability asks, is it the same every time? Again, they are similar concepts in the English language, but when it comes to the language of science, they're different concepts, but it's very important to understand that just because they're different concepts doesn't mean that they're opposite concepts. They're just different concepts. If we're thinking about this in the context of variables, when we think of validity, we want to think of whether or not the independent variable changes the dependent variable. Does the independent variable change the dependent variable? And when we're thinking of reliability, we want to think about it and ask, does the dependent variable stay the same? So a few examples here for you. The first of which will be a scale. And now I want you to consider which scale is valid, which scale is reliable as we go through these particular examples. So first, it is a fact that I weigh 200 pounds. And what I'll be doing, since I have a lot of time on my hands, I will be buying 4 different scales and stepping on each of those 4 scales 10 times each for a total of 40 different readings. For scale 1, I step on scale 1 10 times, and all 10 times the scale shows 200 pounds. All right, now I know for a fact that I do weigh 200 pounds, and all 10 times the first scale shows me an accurate reading of 200 pounds, and also all 10 times it is the same reading, thereby making it both valid and reliable. So scale 1 is both valid and reliable. Scale 2, on the other hand, shows 190 pounds all 10 times. Now, even though it's consistent, meaning that it is reliable, all 10 times it shows me the same reading, the reading itself is not accurate because I'm 200 pounds, the scale shows 190 pounds. So scale 2 is reliable, but scale 2 is not valid. Look very carefully at that. So even though it shows the same number, 190 pounds, all 10 times, that scale is indeed reliable because it's consistent, but not valid because it's not accurate. Scale 3 shows 10 different readings, none of which are 200 pounds, so scale 3 is neither valid nor reliable because for it to be valid, you'd have to show me 200 pounds because I weigh 200 pounds. At no point does it show me 200 pounds, therefore this scale, scale 3, is not valid. Nor is it reliable because it shows 10 different readings. It's not the same reading at any point. Therefore, scale 3 is neither valid nor reliable. Scale 4 is a little unique in one way. Even though clearly it's not reliable because it shows 10 different readings, and for it to be reliable, it would have to show the same readings every time. So we already know that scale 4 is not reliable, but one of those readings is 200 pounds. So does that mean scale 4 is valid, or does it mean scale 4 is not valid? Because 9 out of the 10 times it showed me different numbers, but 1 out of the 10 times it did show me an accurate number, 200 pounds. This is a little bit nuanced, so the answer to that question is that scale 4 is unreliable, is not reliable, because clearly 10 different readings, they're not the same. But a singular reading is valid, but overall it is not valid. Scale 4 is not reliable, and besides for one accurate reading, it's not valid either. So just to recap, scale 1 is both valid and reliable. Scale 2 is reliable but not valid. Scale 3 is neither reliable nor valid. And scale 4 is not reliable, and aside from one singular reading, it's not valid either. Next example involves vehicles, and here you want to ask yourself which vehicle is more valid. So I have a 2018 Jeep Wrangler Unlimited and a 1993 Nissan Sentra Coupe. My Jeep Wrangler, every time I push the start button, it always starts. So pushing the start button is my independent variable, and the vehicle starting up is my dependent variable. On my Nissan Sentra Coupe, turning the key is the independent variable, and the dependent variable again is the same as whether or not it starts. And for my Nissan Sentra, it never starts. So now, which is the more valid vehicle? Which is the more reliable vehicle? This might actually be a little bit surprising, the answers anyway. So from a scientific standpoint, the Jeep Wrangler is more valid. And that's pretty self-explanatory because every time I manipulate the independent variable, meaning every time I push the start button, I get back the desired dependent variable response, which is the vehicle starting. So therefore, there's a correlation between the two. When I change the independent variable, the dependent variable changes with the independent variable. I push the start button, vehicle starts. The Sentra, however, is not valid because every time I turn the key, I do not get the desired or the expected dependent variable response. So I turn the key, I manipulate the independent variable, but but the vehicle does not start, which is obviously not what I want to happen, what I expect to happen. So when it comes to the question of validity, the Jeep Wrangler is more valid. Now, when it comes to the question of reliability, this is where it gets really interesting because if you notice, both have a 100%, consistency in that every time I push the start button, the Jeep Wrangler starts, and every time I turn the key, the Nissan Sentra doesn't start. 100% of the time, both of them, right? So, which is the more reliable vehicle? The answer is both are equally reliable. A vehicle that always starts is as reliable as a vehicle that never starts because both are equally consistent. But at the same time, you wouldn't take the Nissan Sentra or tow the Nissan Sentra to your local mechanic and say, hey, this is a very reliable vehicle, it's just not valid. You wouldn't say that to your mechanic because, as I mentioned, in the English language, reliability and validity are generally used interchangeably. So your mechanic will look at you funny if you tell him that this is a reliable vehicle and it doesn't start when you turn the key. But in the context of science, both vehicles are equally reliable because they are equally consistent. The Jeep Wrangler always starts. The Nissan Sentra never starts. So again, to answer these questions, the Jeep Wrangler is the more valid vehicle, but both vehicles, the Jeep Wrangler and the Nissan Sentra, are equally reliable in the context of science. The next example here is a question of who is more valid and who is more reliable. Let's say you've got two friends. You've got a friend named Nafees and a friend named Alam. Nafees, whenever you invite him over to play video games, he never shows up. So your invitation is the independent variable. That's the variable that you manipulate. And the dependent variable is whether or not he shows up. Nafees never shows up when you invite him over to play video games. No exceptions to this rule. I don't really know why you'd still be friends with him, but you do you. And Alam always shows up when you invite him over to play video games. Again, the invitation is the independent variable because that's the variable that you yourself are manipulating, and the dependent variable is the outcome that from a change in the outcome from a manipulation in the independent variable. The only exception to Alam showing up to play video games with you is back in 2007 when he got a flat tire on his way to your house. So with these two friends of yours, who is the more valid friend and who is the more reliable friend? Now, let's look at this in the context of science, right? So which friend gives you the desired or expected dependent variable response when the independent variable is manipulated? So in layman's terms, who shows up when you ask them to show up? Nafees doesn't, because he never shows up when you expect them or you invite him to show up. Alam always shows up when you invite him to show up, minus that one time in 2007. So we see here in this example that Nafees is not valid and alam is indeed valid because you get the expected dependent variable response. Nafees doesn't show up, that's not what you expect, that's not what you think should happen. And alam always shows up, that's what you expect, that's what you want to happen. Now, here's where we get interesting again, is who is the more reliable friend? Now, remember from the previous example that I said that in the English language, validity and reliability tend often to be used interchangeably in English. But in science, they're different concepts, not opposites, but they're just different concepts. If you look carefully, you'll find that Nafees is actually the more reliable friend. And the reason why is because there was one time alam couldn't make it over to your house to play video games way back in 2007, but Nafees, without any exceptions, never comes over to play video games with you. You see, Nafees's behavior of showing up is more consistent than alam's behavior of showing up, right? So Nafees, 100% of the time, Nafees does not show up. And 99.99999% of the time, alam does show up. So from a scientific standpoint, Nafees is actually the more reliable friend, whereas alam is just a little bit less reliable than Nafees. Now, again, you're not going to tell your parent or your spouse that, you know, your most reliable friend is Nafees, because you operate, and we all do, we operate in the world of language, in the world of English. So we're not going to say that Nafees is more reliable when, you know, it'd be weird to say it in that kind of way in the English language. But scientifically speaking, Nafees is the more reliable friend. Alam is the lesser of the two reliable friends, lesser of the two friends when it comes to reliability, and alam is the more valid friend. Last example, when it comes to at least just simple validity and reliability, is a broken clock valid and is a broken clock reliable? So we have pictured here a clock that is just stuck at 3 o'clock. Now, this clock always shows 3 o'clock, which is a dependent variable, is what does it show, even when it's not 3 o'clock, right? Let's say it's 4 o'clock right now. Let's say it's 5 o'clock right now. Regardless of what time it actually is, the clock always shows 3 o'clock. So is a broken clock valid? Is a broken clock reliable? Well, the answer to the first question, is a broken clock valid, is simple. Twice a day, it's 3 o'clock. So at 3 a.m., the clock is valid, and 3 p.m., the clock is valid, but every other time, the clock is not valid. Is a broken clock reliable now? Consider it in this kind of way. Regardless of what time it is, the clock consistently shows 3 o'clock, right? It could be 4 o'clock, it could be 5 o'clock, it could be 6 o'clock. Regardless of what time it actually is, that clock consistently shows 3 o'clock, thereby making a broken clock definitively more reliable than a functional clock. Now, this is kind of like a mind-blown type of example here, at least the first time I learned it. I learned this in the context of theoretical physics, so it was a little bit of a different environment for me. But it's one of the fundamental rules of the dimension of time, in that the greater validity that you have, the lower the reliability you will have in the context of time. So essentially, if you have a clock that changes with every second, it is by definition not reliable scientifically, because the dependent variable, what it shows you, is always changing. Always changing. But because it's always changing, it's also, if you have it calibrated correctly, it's also correct. It's also correct, right? So from that perspective, the lower the validity correlation, the greater the reliability of a clock, the greater the consistency there as well, right? So this calls into question whether or not time actually exists. Is it a human construct? Is it an illusion? And this is one of the this is one of the reasons why I actually included this in the examples, is that, when I first mentioned that validity and reliability are not opposites, rather they're just different concepts, this is one of the few known examples of where validity and reliability are actually diametrical opposites. The more you have of one, the less you must have of the other, right? So the more validity you have, the less reliability you have. The more reliability you have, the less validity you have. And, time by itself is a very interesting concept to study. We can get into that in a different kind of video, but I just wanted to demonstrate this to you here and just drive home the idea that reliability and validity are different concepts. Generally speaking, they're not opposites, but I wanted to include this example of, an exception to that rule. They're just different concepts generally. This is the only example that I can think of where they are diametrical opposites. So remember, from a definition standpoint, validity measures correlation, reliability measures consistency. Validity asks, is it accurate? Reliability asks, is it the same every time? We've been talking about how validity and reliability in English and in science are just different. In English, they're used interchangeably. That you might even think of them as synonyms in some kinds of ways. And in science, they're not antonyms, they're just different concepts. And in the context of variables, with validity, you want to think of whether or not the independent variable changes the dependent variable. And with reliability, you want to think of whether or not the dependent variable stays the same. Now, to calculate reliability, you may use Cronbach's alpha, and we have it pictured in the background there, Cronbach's alpha. Cronbach's alpha measures reliability, obviously also known as consistency. Cronbach's alpha ranges from 0.00 to 1.00. 0.00, 0.00 communicates no consistency in the data whatsoever, and 1.00 communicates perfect consistency. Now, in the social sciences specifically, you're likely not going to have anything that is perfectly consistent. So what is the threshold that you have to reach to be able to responsibly say that something is consistent, and below which you could say that it's not consistent? That threshold in the physical sciences and in the social sciences is 0.70 or higher. So if you have a Cronbach's alpha of 0.70 or higher, you can responsibly say that the data is consistent enough to be called consistent. So you can say that the data is consistent, the data is reliable, because the Cronbach's alpha is 0.70 or higher. And to measure validity, you have Pearson's R, which is one of the calculations for analysis available to you. Pearson's R measures validity correlation, and the range for Pearson's R is -1 to 1, and -1 shows a perfect negative correlation, which, if you think of a number line, it's a line that goes from high to low as you go from left to right. And then 1.0 or 1, a Pearson's R of 1 communicates a perfect positive correlation, and if you want to think of it in a number line, you might think of it as a line that goes up as it moves to the right. A Pearson's R of 0 communicates no correlation whatsoever. So if you were to see this in a number line, you just see a scatter of dots, and there's just no sensibility to it, would be what a Pearson's R of 0 looks like. And what is the threshold beyond which, or at which, I should say, you can responsibly say that your data is valid? Well, it's a twofold answer. So if you have a Pearson's R of -0.95 or lower, it's correlated enough to be called correlated. And if you have a Pearson's R of 0.95 or higher, it's correlated enough to be called correlated. So with the -0.95 correlation, even though it's not a perfect negative correlation, it is a negative correlation. And with 0.95 or higher, it's, again, not a perfect positive correlation, but it is correlated enough to be called a positive correlation. Now, Pearson's R is a little bit oversimplified. There are other tests that test for things beyond just what's called statistical significance here, and that is effect size. So once again, just to recap, Pearson's R measures correlation, measures statistical significance, and it measures if variables are correlated, only if they're correlated. And it is oversimplified because if you see a Pearson's R of negative 0.95 or lower, it's correlated. And if you see a Pearson's R of 0.95 or higher, it's correlated. But that's not enough. And I'll show you 2 examples of why that is just part of the story. Cohen's d, on the other hand, measures effect size. It measures meaningful significance. There's a difference between statistical significance and meaningful significance. You can have statistical significance without meaningful significance. You could also have meaningful significance without statistical significance. Sometimes you might see meaningful significance phrased as clinical significance, depending on your discipline. Cohen's d measures how much variables are correlated, whereas Pearson's R measures if variables are correlated. Cohen's d measures how much that correlation actually is. And Cohen's d is a little bit more complex than Pearson's R in that Cohen's d of 0 to 0.20 standard deviations equals a small effect. 0.2 to 0.8 standard deviations equates to a medium effect, and a standard deviation of 0.80 or higher shows a large effect. So you already see that it's not quite as simple as Pearson's R, because even in the output, you're not saying it as, Pearson's R is negative 0.95, which is very easy to say, whereas Cohen's d is phrased as, well, Cohen's d is 0.85 standard deviations, right? So it's a little bit more complex to phrase out, and it's also a little bit more complex to properly communicate is what I'm trying to say there. So a few examples here. So I have Nafees' hair loss clinic and Alam's hair loss clinic. Let's say you're struggling with hair loss, right? So one clinic, Nafees' hair loss clinic, has a 1.0 Pearson's R. So it's a positive number. We see that 100% correlation between medication that Nafees' hair loss clinic administers and hair growth. There are no side effects, covered by insurance. You see results in 4 weeks. The results last forever, okay? And Alam's hair loss clinic, though, has less statistical significance, we see. 0.950 Pearson's R, which means 95% correlation between medication and hair growth, which means, in layman's terms, 95% of the people that take this medication from Alam's hair loss clinic, they grow hair. 95% grow hair with Alam, 100% grow hair with Nafees. Both have no side effects. Both are covered by insurance. In both cases, you see results in 4 weeks. Both results last forever. Which medication is better? Which is the better medication? Now, based on this data alone, you might say that Nafees' hair loss clinic medication is much better than Alam's, because with Nafees' hair loss clinic, you have 100% of people growing hair, versus with Alam, you've got 95% of people growing hair. Obviously, I want to be part of the 100%. I want a sure thing, right? I want 100% guarantee that I'm going to grow hair versus a 95% guarantee that I'm going to grow hair. But think about hair for a second and why it's much like anything else, it's a very nuanced concept. If we look at it in this kind of way, if we say that 100% of patients grow hair, but only a few strands of hair, versus Alam's hair loss clinic, where 95% of patients grow hair, but they grow a full head of hair, you see how that puts things into greater context. So what's the point of having 100% guarantee that you're going to grow hair if the number of hairs you grow are just a few strands? Wouldn't you rather have a 95% guarantee that you'll grow hair, and if you fall into that 95% of patients, then you'll grow a full head of hair? Obviously, the latter is the better example there. That's probably what you'd go with, because there's no point, if you're trying to grow hair, to only grow a few strands. So with Nafees' hair loss clinic, Cohen's d might be 0.1 standard deviations, which is a small effect, but with Alam's hair loss clinic, Cohen's d might be 1.42 standard deviations, which is a large effect. So even though there's a 95% success rate versus the 100% success rate for Nafees' hair loss clinic, Alam's hair loss clinic has a Cohen's d of 1.42 standard deviations, which is a large effect, versus the 0.10 standard deviations small effect that Nafees' hair loss clinic medication has. So now I'm going to ask you, which is the better medication? The Pearson's R of 1.000, statistical significance, so 100% of people grow hair, but only a few strands, Cohen's d of 0.10 standard deviations. Or Alam's hair loss clinic, where the Pearson's R is 0.95, which means 95% of patients grow hair, but they grow a full head of hair, a Cohen's d of 1.42 standard deviations. So even though there's greater statistical significance with Nafees' hair loss clinic, there's greater meaningful significance with Alam's hair loss clinic. So despite the fact that you're opting for a lower success rate, that actually does make sense because the success is more profound. Being successful growing a few strands of hair isn't very meaningful. Being a little bit less likely to be successful, but if you are successful, you grow a full head of hair, that is more meaningful. So that's why you see the differences here. I'm going to give you another example. Let's say your goal is to stop smoking, or reduce smoking behavior, I should say. So you've got Wurzweiler smoking cessation and Silberman smoking cessation. So with Wurzweiler, you've got a 95% success rate, so essentially a 0.950 Pearson's R, 95% correlation between the intervention and smoking cessation. So 95% of people who go to Wurzweiler reduce their smoking behavior. Whereas with Silberman, you have a 1.000 Pearson's R, so 100% correlation between intervention and smoking cessation, which means 100% of the people that go to Silberman reduce their smoking behavior. Once again, all other variables are the same here. Both come with no side effects, the interventions I mean. Both are covered by your insurance. You see results for both in 4 weeks. Results last forever. Which is the better medication, or which is the better intervention, right? So here you might say, again, now that you've seen the example prior to this, you're a little bit more suspicious. Well, I want to see the effect size. I want to see Cohen's d for both. You'd be right in that. And I've set it up in this kind of way. You're absolutely right. So with Wurzweiler, you might have a 95% success rate versus Silberman's 100% success rate. But with Silberman, you, in general, go from 20 cigarettes to 18 cigarettes per day. So you're only reducing the number of cigarettes per day by 2 cigarettes, which is not that big of a deal. But with Wurzweiler, despite a lower success rate, you go from 20 cigarettes a day to 2 cigarettes per day, a reduction of 18 cigarettes per day. So you might see a Cohen's d with Wurzweiler of 0.91, which is a large effect, and a Cohen's d with Silberman for 0.09 standard deviations, I should say, which is a small effect. Which is the better medication? Obviously, having seen the previous example, you know the answer to this. Despite the fact that the statistical significance for Silberman is higher in that 100% or Pearson's R of 1.000 versus Wurzweiler's Pearson's R of 0.950, the statistical significance for Silberman is higher. But the meaningful significance for Wurzweiler is higher because you're going from 20 cigarettes to 2 cigarettes a day, as opposed to 20 cigarettes a day to 18 cigarettes per day. So with Wurzweiler, you might have a Cohen's d of 0.91 standard deviations versus the Silberman Cohen's d of 0.09 standard deviations. So you have a large effect with Wurzweiler and a small effect with Silberman. So I hope this helps you understand the differences between Pearson's R and Cohen's D, helps you understand the differences between statistical significance and meaningful significance. Once again, just wanted to go through this slide again. It's the same as the one that I showed you before. Pearson's R measures correlation, Cohen's D measures effect size. Pearson's R measures statistical significance, whereas Cohen's D measures meaningful significance. Pearson's R measures if variables are correlated, and Cohen's D measures how much variables are correlated. Pearson's R can be thought to be somewhat oversimplified in that negative 0.95 or lower, you can call that correlated. Positive 0.95 or higher, you can say that's correlated as well. Whereas Cohen's D is a little bit more complex. You're stating Cohen's D in the context of standard deviations. So 0 to 0.20 standard deviations is a small effect. 0.2 to 0.8 standard deviations is a medium effect, and 0.8 standard deviations or higher would be considered a large effect. So when we come to, go back to, I should say, validity, and we move forward from simple validity to more complex validity, I want to go through 4 different kinds of validity so that when you read about them, when you come across them, you'll know what it says, what it means, and you'll also be able to write about these kinds of validity in your papers. We'll be talking about face validity, content validity, criterion validity, and construct validity. A little bit of a note here, within criterion validity, that being the umbrella term, we've got predictive validity and concurrent validity, and with construct validity being the umbrella term, you've got convergent validity and discriminant validity underneath that umbrella. So face validity first. Face validity is a subjective assessment of whether something measures what it is supposed to measure. It's, as the definition shows, it is subjective. So you can say that something has face validity, or you can say something doesn't have face validity. It's completely subjective. So if you're administered a test, just because you feel like it measures what it's supposed to measure, you can say that there's face validity there. It's subjective. Content validity is a degree to which a measure covers the range of meanings included within a concept. So here in this example, if I'm measuring scholastic aptitude, am I measuring every part of scholastic aptitude? Am I measuring math? Am I measuring reading comprehension? Am I measuring logical reasoning? Right? Am I measuring every part of scholastic aptitude? If I say that I am measuring scholastic aptitude, that is content validity. Now, within criterion validity, you've got 2. So criterion validity itself is an umbrella term. Predictive validity, underneath the criterion validity umbrella, measures future potential. So here you might say something like higher SAT scores correlate with higher collegiate success, right? So it's predictive in that you're taking the SAT now, and it potentially predicts your collegiate success. So that's predictive validity under the criterion validity umbrella. Also under the criterion validity umbrella is concurrent validity, which measures correspondence with a criterion that is known concurrently. So students who achieved collegiate success may be administered the SAT exam because since they've already experienced success, they're likely to test well. Otherwise, why would you say that the SAT measures collegiate success if collegiate success doesn't equate to higher SAT scores? So you might use concurrent validity to see whether or not a tool measures what it's supposed to measure. Next, within construct validity as the umbrella term, construct validity is the assessment of whether measures fit into theoretical expectations. The first example underneath the construct validity umbrella is convergent validity. And if you can think of it in this kind of way, a test that measures scholastic aptitude being compared to a different test that measures scholastic aptitude to see how closely they converge. So just as an example, you might compare or converge the SAT and the ACT exams, or compare the SAT and the ACT exams to see how closely those scores converge with one another. Next, under the construct validity umbrella is discriminant validity, and this has to do with negative association. So a test that measures scholastic aptitude should only measure scholastic aptitude and not another concept. So it shouldn't measure self-esteem, just as an example. So you might have a great deal of self-esteem if you're a good student when it comes to academics. You might not always, but most of the time you'll be very confident in your abilities because you've already shown to be gifted, let's say, scholastically. But are we really measuring scholastic aptitude, or are we measuring self-esteem? So we want to, with discriminant validity, we want to have negative association in that we are specifically measuring scholastic aptitude, and we're also not measuring another concept like self-esteem. In addition to validity, reliability also has some nuance to it, and here we'll go through some examples of more complex concepts within reliability. We've got inter-observer reliability, test-retest reliability, and internal consistency reliability. We'll have the split halves method and the parallel forms method shown here. So first, with inter-observer reliability, you're seeing whether or not observers agree with what's being seen. Now, here, if we've got 3 professors grading your test scores, do all 3 professors agree on a student's test score? Now, just as a reminder, right, because remember, reliability is consistency. Reliability and validity are not synonyms. They are not antonyms. They're not opposites of one another, aside from that one example with time that I showed you. Reliability just measures consistency. It does not measure accuracy. Doesn't ask whether or not something is correct. So even if the professors aren't trained to score the test, you can still have reliability in that all professors agree on your score for the test, even if the score that they agree on is not the correct score. So you can have reliability without validity in any example, really. You can have reliability without validity. Test-retest reliability is the next example here. It's a measure of, is a measure stable over the course of time? So does testing this Monday show the same score as the test from last Monday? Right? So if I'm testing you on a particular subject today versus last week, is it the same, relatively the same scores between last week and this week? That's what test-retest reliability measures. Next, we have internal consistency reliability, and within that umbrella, we've got the split halves method and the parallel forms method. The split halves method asks, is the score from the first half of the test the same as the score from the second half of the test? So if you've got a test that spans, let's say, 100 questions, you might do a split halves method to test reliability to see if the student scored the same, or similarly, I should say, for the first 50 questions as they did for the last 50 questions. Parallel forms method asks, is the score from one test the same as the score from an equivalent test? So once again, if you're taking this test, let's say the SAT, is it the same as your score for the ACT? Now again, the scores may be inaccurate, so reliability can be considered to be consistent in the sense that it stays the same, but not necessarily accurate in the sense that how it's graded may not be correct. But with parallel forms, with the parallel forms method, asking is the score from one test the same as the score from an equivalent test, you might take 2 similar tests to see whether or not the scores for both are similar, are the same, right? So because it tests consistency. That's been validity, reliability with a little bit of effect size sprinkled in. Thank you very much.